guys, we're going to be doing some watercolor texture techniques. These are the creative techniques that are fun and exciting to explore when you're doing a watercolor painting. For this project, you will need some tape, saran wrap, salt. If you have a white crayon or wax, if you have some masking fluid, if you don't have the masking fluid, a rubber cement, you can skip this one if you don't have this at home. And if you have a toothpick or something like a toothpick with an end that can emboss the paper, something like that. You also will need your watercolor supplies like your palette, a mixing tray, and a brush. And you also need cotton ball and a sponge for this project as well. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. We're going to start by labeling our paper off. All right, so we're at the top, let's just label this Watercolor Texture Techniques. Don't forget to put your name at the bottom of your paper, so if it's on the drying rack, you can get it and your class period. All right, so we're going to be dividing this rest of this paper up into 6 sections. So I'm going to be teaching you 6 different techniques. Keep in mind that there are more than 6 texture techniques. These are just the ones I'm going to be teaching, okay? So I'm just going to divide this up into 3 spots here. And then divide this into 3. So then I have my 9 areas. All right. Okay, so we're going to start with number 1, and that one's going to be blooms. Number 2, salt. Number 3, tape. Number 4, resist, and we're going to add emboss in there. Number 5, masking fluid. And number 6, cotton ball sponge. Number 7, is splatter. Times 2. And number 8 is watercolor pencil shavings. And number 9 is plastic wrap. right, once you have all of your boxes labeled, we can get started. All right, now that you have your paper label for your watercolor texture techniques, let's go ahead and get started. I'm just going to be using a number 8 brush. I like to use a larger brush versus a smaller one because I can put more watercolor on at once, but you can paint with your whatever brush you prefer. All right, so we're going to start with blooms. I'm going to go ahead and mark that off. Now you can do blooms with alcohol, and that works pretty good. We're just going to be using water today, but rubbing alcohol works pretty well also. All right, so first thing I'm going to be doing is putting the color that I want in my mixing tray. And I'm going to do 2 different sets of blooms. I'm going to be putting water in here, doing that flat wash, but I want to make sure that the paper stays moist. And if you have enough pigment in there, it is going to be more contrasty. You'll get to see your blooms better. But sometimes you do want a subtle bloom, but if you want to actually visually see it, you want to make sure you have some pigment in there. All right. Now for the bloom, it's kind of tricky because the paper, you kind of have to wait till it's wet, but it has kind of a matte wet to it. So once you have to be doing this for a while, and you just got to get the eye for it. So while that one is starting to get matte, while that's getting matte, I'm just going to throw some yellow down here. The second blooming one. All right, I think it's ready. It's wet, but it's got no big shiny spots. So I'm just going to get some nice clean water. And I have water on this brush, and I'm just going to put little dots of water onto my flat wash. And as you can see, it's blooming. Creating those blooms in there. First bloom didn't work out so well, but you can kind of see it a little bit, but it's not that obvious. So I'm going to do another bloom, but I had painted a yellow wash behind it. So this time when I do the bloom, it should have yellow underneath it versus like a whiter tone. So I'm going to put this blue, I'm going to glaze blue over it. And then wash my brush off. I do have to wait for it to kind of be a matte, dry a little bit of matte. Not dry all the way, but I don't have any shiny spots. And then I can drop the water onto it. I think I put too much. So you can see it's starting to bloom a little bit there. I think I put too much water on this one here, but I may try this technique again later, see if I can get y'all a better example. But you can see here it is blooming. The little yellow blooms are coming out just with the water. Rubbing alcohol will have more of an intense effect. All right, the next one we're going to be doing is salt. I really like this technique. This technique also makes some really nice blooms as well. So you can also do it the same way. You can put down a color and then a darker color and put the salt, or you could just go right into it. So for this salt technique, I'm going to be doing a wet into wet technique. So I'm going to go ahead and wet my paper first. You don't have to do this way, but I like the way it looks. because I want to make sure that there's some intense color onto intense color so that way the salt shows. And do make sure your salt is ready before you start this. Now you can go in with your palette or your mixing tray. I'm just going to go with the mixing tray because since salt's so unpredictable anyways, and I'm not really picky about what hue I want, I'm just going to go right in from the palette. All right, you do have to kind of work a little fast because you don't want the paint to dry, but you also don't want it to be too wet because what's going to happen is the salt will just dissolve. So I think I have it really wet here, so I'm going to take a little bit up. And then when I say a little bit of salt, I mean just a little bit. It already kind of dried in this one area, so it's not going to... That area kind of dried already, so it's not working that well. But we'll see where it didn't dry, how it's going to be looking. So let's just leave it alone. Look at that. That dried too fast. To see what happened, it'll create some blooms as well. All right, we're going to go into tape next. Again, with tape, you could put down one color, then tape over it after it's dry. But tape's a really nice technique for some abstract painting, and then it's also really good for if you want to make straight lines anywhere. So when I'm going to use tape, I like to, so it doesn't rip the paper, put it on a piece of fabric, sometimes like that, and get the lint off on it, so that way it doesn't rip the paper up. Now, you can actually cut the tape to make it a certain size. Cut it with scissors. You can use masking tape. You can actually use painter's tape. I'm just using this tape today. So let's just put this, I'm going to take this tape and cut a piece off, just a tiny piece off there. All right, so for the tape, you just paint around the tape, and then when it's completely dry, pull the tape off. Some kids do some really cool things with tape. They like the negative painting, except for they taped it and then paint it, then taped it, paint it, taped it, paint it, then they went back into it. Makes for some really cool backgrounds. So a lot of these techniques really look nice in combination with each other. So keep that in mind. And we'll just let that dry. All right, we can already see our salt blooming. That looks great. It's doing its job. Looking good, just leave it alone. Let's go ahead and go to the resist next. So if you have a white crayon or candle, this will work. Or white oil pastel, anything that resists water. I'm going to use this candle here. Now I am going to take this and make it into two spots because I want to do two different techniques. All right, so I'm going to use this candle. Every once in a while this doesn't work, and I'm going to make some marks with it. Now honestly, this is something that's a little elementary, but it has its place. Sometimes you just want to just chunk it in like waves if you're doing ocean. I don't know very many professionals that use the resist technique with crayons and wax, but they do sell watercolor wax. All right, so then you can just paint over it and it will resist the paint like that. Ta-da! All right, next we're going to do emboss. For that one, this is an interesting technique. For that one, first I'm going to emboss. I think I'll use this end before I paint and see what happens. This is a little trick if you're doing animals and fur. And then I'm going to paint over it. Let's see what happens. And that paint just sticks in there. And another thing that artists do, you can see those lines where I embossed it, it makes it darker. Another thing I've seen artists do as well is after they paint it, they'll emboss. This is a little, and this is a great way to do some quick texture on an animal. So, and then it just pulls that pigment in and makes it dark there. So that's really nice. All right, so, ooh, look at our salt, looking good. Let's go to masking fluid next. Now, if you don't have masking fluid, you can skip this step. You can also use rubber cement, which is, to me, not very good, but smells. This also smells as well. And it is a brush killer, but I love masking fluid. It has a lot of good uses. I do recommend you use an old brush for this, and if you do use one of your better brushes, you wash it right away. I'm just going to use the same toothpick that I had before. Now, you could actually, with masking fluid, mask off large areas as well. It's a really great way to preserve your whites because, as you know, with watercolor, your white is your paper. And you can cheat and go back with a gouache or a gel pen, but now you do have to wait for this to dry, so we're going to come back with it. I've had kids like make stamps and put the masking fluid on stamps, and it's so nice to have like a lace, like they'll put it on like a little piece of lace and stamp it on. Again, I usually use Frisket, the masking fluid. This is liquid Frisket, but this is the Incredible White Mask. There's lots of different brands. I like the one that's orange because I can actually remember and see where I put it, but this is the one I have at the house. So it's kind of pricey, but it'll last forever if you take good care of it, but it will ruin your brushes, so you have to wash it off right away because it's kind of like has this gummy feeling when it's done. All right, we're going to let that dry, the masking fluid one dry. We're going to go to the cotton ball sponge one. This technique is like a dry brushing technique, and we did that earlier with the brush when we did our traditional techniques. This is a good technique for the very end if you're doing some trees or something that needs some textures, some grass. So I'm just going to wet this palette here. And then I'm going to take my sponge. It's not too wet. So take my sponge. And you know what? I'm going to divide this one in two as well. And I really don't like the cotton ball one because I feel like it wastes a lot of paint. But you can go in there and sponge it in there. It has its uses. Anywhere, this cotton ball is going to make a softer texture. Which is nice if that's what you need, want something soft. Then you can also use a sea sponge, or sometimes in my classroom I just use one of these sponges. I'll just cut it open and use it. I'll just cut it in little pieces for students like this if I don't want to have one of these, so I'll just use this sponge for today. And this sponge, you're going to get like a rougher texture in there. You want to make sure it doesn't have too much water on it, but there's a lot of great things you can do with cotton ball and the sponge in your painting, especially if you're into landscapes, just that last bit of detailing in there. All right, so we're still waiting for our masking fluid to dry. It has to be completely dry, and I can see that it has some wet spots in there. So we're going to go ahead and move on to our splatter. And they're going to divide this one in two. It's the fun one. So when you're splattering doing the splatter technique, you want to make sure you're aware of your surroundings so you don't get paint on your neighbor or yourself or places you don't want it. So when I do the splattering technique, there's a couple different ways. If you want to keep your hands clean, you can take another brush or a pencil and you could just do this to splatter. Or some of my students will use their finger like that to splatter. So it's a great texture technique. And then the other splatter technique is something, sorry, I'm hitting my camera, is where you have to use some lung power. And we will just put a bead of paint down there. So it's a bead of paint, so it has some water, just kind of beat it up in there. And then we're going to use, you could use a straw to blow it out, or you could just blow directly on it like that, and that'll just splatter it out like that. So it looks a little silly, but you'd be surprised how many people use this technique. When you start seeing it in their paintings, you're like, I know how they got that. So that is how you do larger splatters like that. You never want to take your brush and just whack it like that, because the paint will go across the room onto somebody's painting or them, and they will be upset with you. You could even get it on yourself. All right, the next one we're going to do is a watercolor pencil shaving. This one I really like. So I have, that's one thing I forgot to tell you guys to get. So in the beginning, you need a watercolor pencil and a pencil sharpener. So if you don't have watercolor pencils, you can skip this one as well at home. But if you have them in the classroom, we'll go ahead and use them. So I'm going to go grab mine real fast. All right, so what you're going to do is, there's a lot of different ways you could do this, but we're going to do a wet on wet technique. So I'm going to wet the paper here with water. I could wet it with a color and use a different color. Then I'm going to take a watercolor pencil, could be any kind. You always know because that's a little paintbrush on it, no matter what brand it is. And I'm just going to kind of, you can use an X-Acto knife to do this. I'm just going to put the shavings in there. So I kind of sharpened it so where the edge is showing. And then I'm just going to sharpen the very tip in there. I guess it'd be easier to do this with an X-Acto knife. Into the water. And let it dry. And it just kind of splurts out, and then when it's dry, you can, if you have any excess, you can wash it off, but it makes a really cool texture and it's pretty intense. So that's how you can use watercolor shavings. Since I have a watercolor pencil here, if you have one, you can see that it is water soluble. There's a lot of different ways to use a watercolor pencil. When you're painting, you can actually take it and you can just paint from the tip to get the color. It's also really great, going back to the splatter, you can actually wet it and do a splatter technique with it too. So it has a lot of good uses, a watercolor pencil, and you can do a whole painting with these as well. If you don't have watercolor palette, you can have some watercolor pencils and use the same way you use watercolor. All right, while we're waiting for that to dry, let's go back to our masking fluid. I believe mine's dry. If yours is not dry, just wait a few more minutes before you do this technique. And I'm just going to go over it with some paint. You could really build up with masking fluid. I could go in here, do it, and then wait for it to dry, put some more. Just like you would do a negative painting. So it's a lot of fun to use. And it's really great if you want those hard edges, preserve those whites, because watercolor sometimes is feisty. It just does what it wants to do. So any kind of control you can get on it is always helpful. All right, so I'm gonna let that dry. And look at that soft, nice. I'm going to go to the last technique, which is the plastic wrap. So I have here some just saran wrap. And this saran wrap you can reuse over and over. I think it's kind of cool when you reuse it because sometimes the paint stays on it and it adds a color that you previously used onto an area of texture. So For this one, we're going to do a wet on wet technique. Again, I'm going to wet the paper. My water's getting dirty. And then I'm going to take the pigment. Now, you kind of want the pigment to be pretty intense because it works better. The effects are better for this technique, but you can also do it subtle as well. You want to make sure it has enough water in there. It's a little on the juicy side. And then I'm going to take my saran wrap and put it on the paper. And then I'll just kind of move it with my hands until I get the texture I want. And then you just let it sit and dry. Let it sit and dry. So we're going to let this sit and dry. When it's done, I will show you when all this is dry. We're going to take the tape off, take the masking fluid off, take this off, and then we'll have all of our texture techniques. All right, now that our paper is dry, we can take the excess salt off. And then we can also take the tape off. Isn't that nice? So you can actually cut this and make it into little shapes. It's nice and clean. This wax stays on there, but here's our masking fluid. So you can actually take this off with an eraser or your finger. Just be careful because sometimes your finger gets dirty, and then with the paint that's on there, and then it will make your white areas. But it really does a good job at preserving that white. Kind of got a little rough with that one. I don't know if I mentioned this, but masking fluid stinks. It smells disgusting. All right, that looks good. There's our splatters. I think I got a little chunky with that shavings, but it's still pretty interesting. I probably could have used an X-Acto knife for that. And then here's our plastic wrap. Let's just take that off. Nice. All right, so that is our watercolor texture techniques, and a lot of great uses for these: backgrounds, landscapes, abstract paintings, trees and bushes, landscapes, preserving whites, animals. This looks really good on abstract and landscapes as well. And you'd be surprised where people use this plastic wrap technique, but it's great for abstract paintings and backgrounds as well. All right, hope you learned something new. Bye.